Okay, so we're going through again. We're going through a number of ideas from the 1830s to the 1850s, seeing how those ideas get projected into our own time. And I think one figure to deal with now is, well, we all know the name Hegel, right? And Hegel, basically, one of his central ideas, which if you read the Copleston account of Hegel, Copleston said for whatever mistakes Hegel made, one thing that he did is he came up with kind of a modern version or a modern way of explaining providence. Providence was essentially the spirit guiding history. And Hegel had this idea of the spirit, kind of the zeitgeist, moving or guiding history. Now, after Hegel dies, among his disciples, we say that there's right-wing and left-wing Hegelians.
You mean right-wing in terms of?
So the right-wing Hegelians were Hegelians that tried to keep Hegel's idea of the spirit present in his thought, present in thinking. And they tended in the direction of promoting kind of romantic nationalism, various sorts of romantic nationalism. Sometimes they even found themselves in alliance with romanticists of various sorts. Some of them convert to Catholicism. The left-wing Hegelians are the ones who deny the reality of spirit, and they basically take Hegel's idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and they start to apply it in a materialistic way to history. Right? So the thesis would be any given set of structures that dominate the material world in any given moment. The antithesis would be a kind of a minority or left out or unforgotten structure, minority structure within the power framework of the time that revolts against the majority structures. And then once that revolt happens, you get the synthesis, the new set of power structures that exist, right? And so it's from the left-wing Hegelians that we'll start to see the emergence of the Marxist thought. One guy who's also another proto-Marxist is a guy named Feuerbach.
Yeah. He's the religion guy?
Man is God to man.
Yeah, there you go. So Feuerbach, essentially for Feuerbach, Christ doesn't exist. Christ is an idea. Christ is a kind of a myth, and the passions of the apostles project themselves and kind of create Christ. There was in this time in the 1830s and 40s, there's all these interesting figures that rise up in theology that are basically promoting Christ as some sort of a myth, right? You get the biography of Strauss, not Leo Strauss, but the first Strauss, who writes a life of Christ that becomes really popular in Germany, also saying Christ is some sort of an ideal or a myth. You get this fellow Bauer, who will apply kind of this kind of proto-Marxist idea to the Gospels, saying that Peter is the ideal or the thesis. Paul is the negation of Peter, right, or the antithesis. And John is the resolution or the synthesis, right? Yeah. But and then what's interesting is a lot of these guys become like the forerunners of modern scriptural scholarship. Just to
bring us down a notch.
So then, also, I think also just for the sake of, let's say something about Feuerbach first, okay? So Feuerbach actually ends up having a kind of interesting influence in the United States, kind of through. So we'll explain at some point how Marxists kind of come together in England, especially in the 1830s and 40s, And of course, one of the writers, one of the authors that inspires a lot of their thinking is Feuerbach. And what ends up happening is that there, as we've also kind of been saying, you can see in the 1820s, the 1830s, right? There's a series of like minor revolutions, student revolts, in reaction to various problems or circumstances. We'll go over some of those later on. And by the kind of culmination of these kind of revolutionary efforts is the revolutions of 1848. In the revolutions of 1848, it seemed like there was a concerted effort in many countries of Europe to overthrow the European regimes. Like there was kind of like just like a funnel head. And these revolutions, by and large, failed. But sometimes, in some places, it took 2 years to put them down. So, for example, in France, by 1850, the revolts are put down, and they're put down by a kind of coup, which leads to the rise of Napoleon III, the government of Napoleon III, which lasts until 1870. Right? It's about a 20-year rule. And essentially, actually, it's interesting, we were talking about the neocons last night. Essentially, that was the deal that Napoleon III made with the Catholics. That you don't criticize my efforts of building up the French Empire. Don't criticize, laissez-faire capitalism, which I'm about to implement in France. And I won't persecute the church. That was kind of the deal. The deal that was made, which fell apart in a radical way in 1870. And the new government that came to power was a radical leftist government, and they exiled they kicked all the religious orders out of France. But then what's interesting, just from a standpoint, it's also during this time, it's after this kind of revolt of 1870 that you start to see everything gets put in place that leads to the building of this basilica in France to the Sacred Heart, Sacré-Cœur.
Yeah.
Right? It gets built after this revolt of 1870 in reparation for all the wicked things that were done during that revolt.
Oh, that's great.
So anyway,
It's beautiful.
that's a little aside. So after the revolutions of 1848, the Communist Party kind of forms at this point, and they essentially. I think you can say essentially at this point they come to the realization, they kind of make a decision. They say, when you're talking about the countries of, like, if you're talking about France, Spain, Italy, Germany, these countries, this weight of Catholicism is too great. You can't just have a revolution and undo the whole thing. There's just we've been trying since the French Revolution. We keep getting these victories, we exile the religious orders, but Catholicism keeps coming back, right? So we need more kind of long-term culture war in Western Europe. And actually, it's very interesting, just as another aside, in 1998, I was in France, and they had this documentary, which they put on television, which we watched in the center, reflecting on, it was like the 30th anniversary of the revolutions of 1968. And they interviewed this guy who now, in 98, was a Green Party politician in France and in Europe. The last I saw, he was a delegate, actually not in France, but in Germany, to the EU Parliament. His name is Bendit Khan. Bendit Khan was his last name. So anyway, so they were interviewing this guy, and they did an interview. He was like the main person that they interviewed in explaining the whole progression of what led to the revolt of 1968 in the United States and in France and in the rest of Europe, and also kind of what happened afterwards.
The revolution.
So the Cultural Revolution of 68. So this guy, in the interview, what he tells in the interview is he says, we had meetings, right? We had meetings in the early 60s. He was a closet Marxist in the early 60s. And he said, we had meetings in the early 60s in which we determined that we would use pacifism in opposition to the Vietnam War as a way of trying to stoke student revolts that could bring down the governments of Western Europe and the United States, which would lead to kind of socialist or Marxist governments, which would then, we'd end the Cold War that way. In other words, they too were thinking big. And then he said, so we beginning in the early 60s began planning and agitating on campuses and universities in Germany, France, England, and the United States. And the SDS was one of their big operations in the United States.
It was said
Students for Democratic Socialism. And he said the press ate us up. We were darlings of the press right away. And given the way things were happening with Vietnam, with the development of rock and roll, Bob Dylan, the success of that kind of music and all this kind of stuff, he said we basically, by 64, 65, we thought 68 would be the year. So they tried to stoke all these riots in 68, anti-Vietnam protests, with the hopes that the students would kind of rise up and they could get a rebellion going. And he said, so we had these riots going from like 68 to 70, 71. But then we realized by 71, 72 that there just weren't enough students. The students and the workers didn't unite, right? They didn't unite. There weren't really enough students. They didn't really take to the streets for violence in the way we kind of hoped. So then we decided, and he was. I mean, again, everything I'm telling you, this was on French television. It was a documentary on French television in 1998. There was I didn't have to read any like special book, right? I just sat there on the couch drinking my wine, right? And he said, so by 72 we decided that again we needed another generation or two of cultural combat. And so we decided in 72 we would take on the mask of pacifism again, and we would work under the mask of pacifism to try to basically further destabilize the culture so that at some day again we could kind of get the Marxist revolution going again. And so by 98 he was a politician.
What was his name?
Bendit Khan. Benditk.
I found he's Daniel
OH.
Cohn-Bendit.
Cohn-Bendit. Cohn-Bendit.
Cohnbendit.
Cohn-Bendit. That's the guy, yeah. Bendit Khan, Cohn-Bendit, yes. So I think a similar thing happened I think his experience of 1968 was just a replay of the experience of the communists in 1850. Now, when the communists, they came up with a strategy in 1850. They said, we can't subvert in Western Europe, but we can potentially pull off a revolution either in the United States or in Russia. And the reason they thought about Russia is they thought, well, in Russia, the only real schools are these seminaries. And they already knew kind of that, well, a lot of the seminaries is where you already went in the first place to get radical Enlightenment ideas by that point. And then secondly, they realized, well, if you can actually, in Russia, the country hasn't really gone through the process of like robust capitalism. And so you could potentially in Russia just take out the Tsar, assassinate the Tsar, and then by taking out the Tsar, you could then just use the Russian bureaucracy to implement perfect communism. All right, so they thought that would be one possibility.
This is back in 1850.
This is 1850, yeah. The other possibility would be the United States. And in the United States, they thought you have 10 to 12% of the population that you could get to rise up and revolt, and they could be the lumpen proletariat of your revolution.
Lumpen proletariat.
Yeah, the lumpen proletariat are the people that die for the revolution so that the proletariat can govern. So they're basically the cannon fodder for the revolution. And of course, they thought the lumpen proletariat would be the black slaves. So they basically, at this point, they start to try to infiltrate the anti-slavery movement in the United States. And one of their agents that goes to the United States is this woman named Ottilie Assing.
Good. We never heard of her.
Yeah. That's weird.
Like Harriet Beecher Stowe.
And Ottilie Assing basically was kind of like enamored with Frederick Douglass. So she comes to the United States to seduce Frederick Douglass.
To
And-
seduce him?
To seduce him. And she does.
Wow.
And she gets Frederick Douglass to leave his wife, Mary Fagan, who freed him from slavery. And they cohabitate for 20-some years. And she introduces Frederick Douglass to Feuerbach.
Oh my no.
Yes. Yes. When I told this to my...
Where was Adelie from?
Pardon?
Where was Adelie?
I think she was from, Germany, Poland, Germany, Poland, in that part of the world. So she basically convinces Frederick Douglass that Feuerbach is right, and they cohabitate for 20 years. One of the signs she convinces Douglass is that by the time you get to his last speeches, some of his last public speeches are to the black Baptist ministers of the U.S. And he basically, when he speaks to them, he reveals himself as an atheist, and he tells them, you should abandon this religion that's trying to put you down. And
Frederick Douglass was an atheist?
yeah. And they boo him off the stage.
That's right.
Now, they do. They booed him off the stage. The black Baptist preachers booed him off the stage
Trump
in
people.
the 1870s. And then in her biography, her biographer claims that she helped also finance and get arms to John Brown.
John Brown, the
Yeah.
revolutionary
Yeah.
revolutionist. Wow.
Because the idea was because her one of her purposes was to try to get revolutionary ideas into the black population and get a revolution going. So, and actually, I think in this book that I mentioned the other day by Murray Friedman, What Went Wrong, one of the histories that he follows in his book is how at every step of almost every generation, it's kind of he presents it as kind of a tragedy that with Frederick Douglass, at the foundation of the NAACP was founded by communists, and they basically engaged in a press campaign to trash the character of Booker Washington and to promote William Du Bois as their front man. But the actual foundation of the NAACP was like 6 communists and Du Bois as the poster child.
No way.
Yes, way.
Way.
Murray Friedman, What Went Wrong? And then 20 years later, there's a Marcus Garvey. He was a black nationalist. He walked into the headquarters of the NAACP in New York because he wanted to fight for black rights. And he walked in and he said, "Where are the black people?" and he got super. That's what led to him getting super infuriated with the NAACP, because he said they're all communists. They're not fighting for black rights. They're fighting to overthrow the country. So Murray Friedman shows his story actually in his book What Went Wrong, of how each generation, he thinks it's tragic that at each generation at the leadership of the black people in the United States, you get communist leaders that basically get the black people's wires crossed. And it always leads to a destruction of the black family, the corruption of black culture, and the inability to kind of become stable. So that's Friedman. And yes.
How much of this is actually, is this just not Marxist ideas just contaminating the fight for rights? So
What do you mean?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of Marxist influence in
Well, I mean, Marxism is a politics of the passions,
yeah.
primarily. And so and also it's anti-family. And it's commitment to social agitation before anything else. Right? So, I mean, there's all sorts of other things that to explain the history of black people in this country it's a real tragedy, I think, on many levels. I don't think this is the only factor. But if you kind of start committing people to this politics, right, you're basically, it's part of a formula for disabling the family from ever stabilizing. And a lot of times, I think, a lot of times, and I said this, I had a class once of gang black gang members from South Bend, and I would say this kind of stuff to them, right? And they understood, that a lot of their ideas and they don't even realize that are Marxists. They don't know that they're Marxists, but that's just what they've been taught. That's what but there's just statements that get put into them, drilled into them, and and so it takes a lot actually to kind of, because you got to dig through now. A lot of these ideas were getting implanted, beginning with Frederick Douglass.
So what kinds of ideas? What are examples?
Well, I mean, just the whole understanding things is there's all these white people, they're oppressing us, we're the kind of minority poor, and we need to agitate for our rights, right? I mean, that kind of just pattern of thinking. Because and it very quickly also becoming angry at things, which would be another.
Talking about like structural racism.
Yeah, I was seeing inequalities and having that lead to anger. And actually, I mean, I know some black pastors also in South Bend, and a lot of them are aware of this. Or several of them are aware of this, and they're consciously trying to. They're trying to actually kind of, just be more virtue oriented in the way they even preach, because they're aware of these kind of intellectual problems. So. So if we move from there now, I just want to say a few things. Oh, also, let's talk about Russia. So one of the reasons they go to Russia is that they're aware too that in Russia you have the Tsar and you have the Orthodox Church, but really they understand that most of the advisors around the Tsar they embrace the Enlightenment in one way or another. There's much less of a filter in Russia. I mean, many of the advisors around the Tsar, they embrace the Enlightenment, they embrace nationalism, which is kind of the Enlightenment creation of nationalism. They do want a strong Tsar, they promote authority. Solzhenitsyn, in his book 200 Years Together, he points out that because Russia in the 1790s went from having like 1,000 Jewish people to having 90% of the Jewish people in the world. And so Solzhenitsyn's last book he said, we got to write a history of what happened. And he points out in his book that especially from like 1800 till about 1890 or so, the people who are implementing how to deal with this new Jewish population, by this point the Jewish people are kind of very much on the side of, we just want to live the Enlightenment. And so the Russian administrators basically are like perfectly gracious with their Jewish population, and they try to incorporate them into the society on Enlightenment principles, right, without any filter. Like everybody's pro-Enlightenment, everybody's pro-liberal, everybody's pro-Enlightenment. So, in part, the story that Solzhenitsyn tells in this poem is that it's kind of an unexplained tragedy. How everybody was just super happy with the Enlightenment in Russia, as far as the cultured classes and the educated classes, but it ends in this tragedy of the Russian Revolution, right? And that's one of the principal themes of Solzhenitsyn's life. By the way, Dostoevsky began his public life in the 1840s and 50s as a socialist who was part of one of these cells that set out to assassinate the Tsar, to bring about the socialist revolution. And maybe some of you know the story.
It's worth retelling.
But it's probably worth retelling. So So literally, his little cell that was going to assassinate the Tsar, they had everything planned out. Like when the Tsar was going to walk down the street in St. Petersburg, and how they were going to basically take him out. And a day or two before the planned assassination, an agent of the Tsar came in and arrested them. So somehow the information got out. the plot got out and they got arrested. So they were taken to trial. If you ever go to St. Petersburg, you can actually still go to the prison where he was held, because it's right across the river from the main kind of downtown part of St. Petersburg. He was taken to trial with his 5 buddies. They were found guilty. The penalty at that time for trying to assassinate the Tsar was death penalty by firing squad. So they took them out to the... They took the 5 of them out to the firing squad. They said, ready, aim. And before they said fire, somebody comes in and says, the Tsar has commuted the sentence, right? Rather than death by firing squad, it's, I think, 6 to 8 years in Siberia.
Siberia.
And the work camps in Siberia. At that point, actually, one of the guys died of a heart attack.
Before or after the announcement of
Yeah.
I don't know exactly when, but right. One of them had a kind of nervous breakdown, and never recovered from it. And actually, so Dostoevsky will sometimes have a character like that in his novels. And then Dostoevsky, the rest of them got taken right to the train station. They were put on a platform where they were waiting for a long time. And while they were waiting, there was a society in Russia for handing out copies of the 4 Gospels. So there was this middle-class woman who was part of this society, and she basically put into Dostoevsky's arms a copy, not of the whole New Testament, of the 4 Gospels. And that's what he brought with him to Siberia.
No.
That was, yeah. And that's where he had his conversion. Right? That's where he had his conversion, and he came out of his conversion convinced that Russia was she was facing disaster because of all these Enlightenment ideas that were undermining the Russian. They were going to undermine the Russian regime, and so in his novels Demons, that's where he basically lays out in his novel Demons that if we don't kind of stop the flow of these ideas. Well, actually, in all of his novels, I think Notes from Underground was his first one, but Demons especially, this is the case. But I think in all of his ideas, the basic trajectory is you have all these Enlightenment ideas in Russia. They're all leading to the corrosion of Russian society. They're culminating in nihilism. And if we don't put a stop to them somehow by a return to the ethics and the spirit of the Gospels, it's going to lead to a revolution. There's going to be a century of blood. And then he kind of speculates, but maybe at the end of that century of blood, Russia will return to her faith, and return to kind of her more rational foundations, right? But it would take a century of blood to purify Russia from the corruption of the Enlightenment, right? Dostoevsky also thought from a political standpoint that Russia would be foolish to ever go against Germany, that the way Russia would naturally economically develop would be through kind of a union of German technology and engineering with Russian resources. And we'll get back to that later on. So this is the trajectory of Russia. This is the trajectory of Russia. Poland at this point is a non-entity. I mean, there's the Polish nation, but there's no Polish government. As I said earlier, most of the elite Polish intellectual class, people like Koziuko, they had kind of gone over to the Enlightenment. So the Polish bishops, but the Poles in the 1830s, there was a revolt against the Russians. There's another revolt in the 1880s, but both the Pope and the bishops are weary of this revolt because they see it as an Enlightenment revolt, and they don't see it's also a violent revolt. So they don't really see it going anywhere. And in fact, this always seems to be the problem with the Poles, even up until Solidarity in the 1980s. That after the crackdown on Solidarity in 79-80, they were contemplating getting arms basically from the CIA, and going into revolt, like violent revolt. And actually, John Paul II had a meeting with them, and apparently he had enough clout with them to convince them to not do it, to use other means to bring down the regime, but to not go into violent revolt. So, I think in that case it worked. But even going back, but in the 1830s, a lot of people in Europe, they're looking at the Polish revolt as like, well, this is the sign of freedom. This is how Enlightenment freedom is going to make itself manifest. Could this be an example of holy violence? Another thing that starts getting popularized in the 1830s is there a savior, a guy named Boucher, a French guy named Boucher, right? He starts writing these. He writes a book at some point about, and the basic thesis of the book is there a savior nation? Right? Is there a nation that, because of the movement of history, because of the way the Spirit works in history, can we say now that there's a savior? Was France, for example, during the French Revolution, were they a savior nation that got crucified? Right? That's what. Or he'll say, or he'll wonder. He actually wonders at one point. He starts to think, well, maybe if France wasn't the savior nation, maybe the United States was the savior nation.
I
Right?
don't think we mean it in a good way, though.
No, he meant it in a good way.
Yeah, but for us, it's not.
I think for us that's a little blasphemous. Yeah.
Well, but also he's talking about like a savior in terms of like for Enlightenment values.
Yeah. But like the Christ, like it's the new Christ.
Right.
He doesn't believe in Jesus Christ.
Right.
He believes that Jesus Christ is a spirit.
Is he Feuerbach?
I don't think so. I think he was before Feuerbach, but
It's Jungian.
it's clearly kind of it's that way of thinking. Now at this point we want to say something about the Ottoman Empire, and we want to say something about the rise of radical Islam.
All right. Father Jeff, can I ask a quick question on that last point?
Yeah.
Is it important, or do you have an idea of why Boucher was asking this question? And there's like where's
Because basically they're all trying to find, whether it's Marxist, whether it's libertarian, all the different forms of Enlightenment thought, and there's many different forms. I'm not saying there's only one, but they're all looking for what's our shining example, right? What's the nation that has finally, as Voltaire said, crushed the church, gotten rid of tyranny, despotism, infamy, priestcraft, right?
Black reaction.
The black reaction, right? Where is our shining light? What nation can we look for? The church always said it was a universal kingdom that's meant to last in saecula saeculorum, right? So what's the nation in which light will finally manifest itself and once and for all show that there's a new order of the ages, the Novus Ordo Seclorum, right?
It wasn't England, huh?
Well, no, because they hated the British system.
Right.
Many of them were also critics of the British system
Because it was too Machiavellian.
because it was so Machiavellian and brutal. They kind of detested its brutalness, and it didn't have a reputation for treating the poor and the peasants that well. So they were trying to find, is there something other than the British system that we can have hopes in? So Wakanda. There you go. Wakanda. Yes.
So where are the values of the romanticism here? So do some of them kind of get blended in?
So the Romantics break off into 5 or 6 different groups, right? One set of Romantics becomes Catholic. Other Romantics become nationalists. They say if you look deep into the history of your country, you're going to find, right, who you truly are. Goethe is like this. Goethe, Faust. He's a German he's a kind of Enlightenment German Romantic. The character in Notes from Underground is a Romantic, and the Dostoevsky, but he's a Romantic that descends into nihilism, right? Stefan Trofimovich in The Possessed is a kind of Enlightenment Romantic, and of course all his child and all of his child's buddies become nihilist revolutionaries, right? So some Romantics become Catholic, some become like nationalists, others become some sort of nihilists, or some of them morph then into more other kind of like Marxist revolutionaries even. So they kind of break off into all sorts of different directions.
Wherever their feelings take them.
Pardon?
Wherever their feelings.
Yeah, it's wherever their deep feelings take them. Yeah, that's right. So, yes. Is it an aside or a relevant
I
question?
forgot my question.
Good. Good. So we want to go now to the Ottoman Empire. Now, I think it's important. I mean, I think it's just I'm going to give just a brief outline of the history of Islam. But I think you can do a just job of giving it kind of a brief outline in this sense. From the death of Muhammad, for the next 150 years or so, it's rapid expansion, rapid military expansion. And essentially, Islam is a lot like Judaism. It's a lot like Protestantism. It's a lot like the mentality that many people can fall into, in the sense that if you're winning military victories, God must be on your side, right? Military victory. I mean, that's what the Greeks thought. That's what the Romans thought. It's what the Jews thought of the Old Testament. It's not like some sort of, it's not what we think if you read like St. John Chrysostom. Pardon?
Sports teams, they think it.
Sports teams, I mean, right? So the Muslims had this rapid expansion. And of course, one of the countries that they conquer is what now is called Iran or Persia, which has an ancient civilization, which is fairly sophisticated in science, mathematics, technology, astronomy, right? Medicine. And so it's actually, I think I can say this, that a lot of the bureaucracy of what becomes the caliphate is run by Persians. And since they have a long tradition of running bureaucracies to run empires, they can run the empire. They can run the caliphate. And they actually run it in a kind of, very moderate way. They don't apply. They don't interpret the Quran strictly initially. They're very, when they walk into India, when they take over India, and the Quran says you got to either kill or make into slaves anybody who's not a Jew or a Christian or a Nestorian. So they walk into India and they see all these Hindus worshiping one of 3,000 gods, right? Hunan, the monkey god, or whatever. And, or Kali, right? And so basically they ask their advisors, what do we do? And the advisors say, well, I think these people are monotheists. Right?
Check them off.
So we don't have to enslave them, or we don't have to kill them. We just tax them. And actually in many places, the way the Christians end up first proposing their loyalty to Islam is that the taxes that they have to pay under the Quran were less than what they had to pay in the Byzantine Empire. Right? So a lot of times in North Africa and where other lands that they took over, at least initially in that first 150 years, a lot of them, there were battles, there were, I'm not saying that everything was peaceful. I'm not saying that they were like promoters of peace and joy. But in many instances, certain villages and certain provinces in North Africa, they just thought they were just switching the tax code. And they were getting a tax break. And the Byzantine Empire couldn't get people there to fight about it. So they take over, but very quickly they grow, and they grow to a point where they don't really lose, and from their point of view, they don't lose many battles. And in fact, from their point of view, like the battle of Poitiers against Charles Martel, right? Hilaire Belloc writes about it. It saved Western civilization. I mean, for their point of view, that was like us right now losing a battle in Kabul, Afghanistan. In other words, it doesn't affect our way of life. We don't think so much. It doesn't get us into any kind of a crisis. Because they thought the Franks were just these barbarians, these absolute barbarians. If you read some of the diplomatic letters, that at one point the Islamic ambassadors go to the court of Charlemagne to try to work out some deals, right? And the letters they write back to the Caliph are really insulting letters. But they're just saying what they observe. These people have crooked teeth. They don't know how to clean their teeth. They don't know the basics of medicine. They don't know basic taxation policies. They don't even know how to like collect taxes in their provinces so they can keep their castle in the same place. They don't know how to heat their homes in adequate ways. Right? So they go through like one thing after another where they say these people are basically barbarians. They don't understand what civilization is. and actually their derogatory term for all Europeans is Franks.
Wow.
Right? So they just start calling, if you're from Europe, you're a Frank. And that's like saying the N-word. Right? No, it is. I mean, it's kind of a derogatory word for them. Because the Europeans are just a bunch of barbarians. They're a bunch of uncivilized barbarians that have no civilization. Right? So, and this basically, so what happens is then in the 12th century, there's a big shift in Islam in the 1100s. And the big shift in Islam in the 1100s is the Turks come in from Central Asia, and they basically take over Islam. And the Turks at that point had basically adopted a kind of radical form of Sunni Islam, which is basically a kind of fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. So like, for example, when they arrive in Damascus, there's this Platonic philosopher. They consider him, a lot of times people that write about medieval philosophy in Islam, they'll say he was the last philosopher, or the last public philosopher. So this guy, his name is Suahardi. And Suahardi was teaching in the court of the Caliph. The Caliph found out that he was a Platonist. And so the Caliph, his punishment was, you have philosophized like a Christian, you will die like one. So he crucifies him. And so at that point, philosophy goes underground.
So who kills him? Sorry, the Turks?
The Caliph, who's Turkish now.
So was this like a coup, or is this an invasion?
An invasion, coup, takeover.
Just like the Asherists destroying the Methuselahs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, again, this is just a quick history. I don't, obviously I'm not going into all the things here, right? But so basically, beginning around 1200 or so, the Turks take over. Eventually, they get all the way to Constantinople. From their standpoint, they never really lose major battles to the Franks, and they kind of just pardon. They don't consider that like a significant loss, from their own historical standpoint. It saves Christendom, but again, for them, Christendom is like this barbaric place, like kind of a little bit like we got to take it over eventually, but maybe we really don't want to. I mean, I know a little bit that's the attitude.
They had from Spain to Turkey, so there wasn't much in between.
They had by the height of the Ottoman Empire, they had from Spain to the Pacific. Right? They had 100 by the height of the Ottoman Empire, they ruled an empire of 120 nations from North Africa, from Gibraltar, to the Pacific Ocean.
What was their connection? Which
China?
country?
Through this India, and then into Southeast and Indonesia, right?
Was there political unification?
That's what I'm getting to.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Is that why there's a lot of Muslims in Indonesia?
Yeah.
Malaysia.
So it's time for the break. So we have to take a break there.